An entire civilization vanished from the face of the earth. This is the enduring mystery of Greenland's lost Viking colony, a thriving society that simply disappeared, leaving only empty farms and silent churches behind. By the end of this, you will understand why this isn't just a cold case of history, but a profound spiritual riddle. We will explore how changing climates and failing economies tell only part of the story, and why whispers of angry land spirits and desperate magical rituals may hold the final key. What forgotten truth could make hundreds of people abandon their world without a trace? The year was 985 when a fiery-tempered explorer named Erik the Red first set foot on this vast, icy shore. Exiled from Iceland for murder, he saw not a barren wasteland, but a land of opportunity, a place he shrewdly named Greenland to attract settlers. His gambit worked. Ships filled with hopeful families followed him, carving out a life in two distinct pockets of this new world. The larger eastern settlement nestled in the south, while a smaller, more daring western settlement was established farther up the coast. For centuries, this was not a struggling outpost. It was a society. They built sturdy stone churches, some of which still stand as silent ruins today. They raised livestock on grassy fjords, worshipped their Christian god under a bishop sent from Europe, and traded vital goods like walrus ivory back to the continent. This was a vibrant, resilient colony, a piece of medieval Europe thriving at the very edge of the known world. Their success seemed permanent, a testament to human endurance. Which makes what happened next so utterly bewildering. That wedding at Hvalsey Church in 1408 stands as a final, flickering candle in the growing dark. We have a record of it, a brief account of a couple joining in marriage, surrounded by their community in a stone church that still stands today. It is a powerful, deeply human moment. People celebrated, they feasted, they looked toward a future, and then the written record from Greenland simply stops. For years after that, the silence from the colony was not immediately alarming in Europe. It was a gradual fading, like a distant star dimming, until you are no longer sure you ever saw it at all. Trade ships that periodically braved the voyage from Iceland and Norway began to return with strange and unsettling reports. They would arrive at the familiar fjords, calling out for their trading partners, only to be met with a profound silence. The settlements were empty. Farms stood abandoned, their doors creaking in the wind. No smoke rose from the hearths, no livestock grazed in the fields. It was as if the entire population had simply walked away, leaving their homes, their churches, and their entire way of life behind. This is the heart of the mystery. What terrible chain of events unfolded in those silent years between the last joyful celebration and the first chilling discovery of an empty land? How does an entire civilization, with its history and its people, simply vanish from the earth without a single clear message left behind? The silence they left behind demanded an answer, and for a long time, science has pointed to one overwhelming culprit. The sky itself turned against them. The most widely accepted explanation is a climatic catastrophe known as the Little Ice Age. This was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, relentless squeeze that gripped the North Atlantic for centuries. Starting around the 1300s, average temperatures began a steady and brutal decline. Imagine a summer that arrives later and later each year, its warmth feeble and short-lived. The growing season, once long enough to harvest hay to feed livestock through the long winter, shriveled away. Fields that once provided a reliable bounty now yielded only meager, frost-bitten grass. For a society utterly dependent on farming and animal husbandry, this was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. The cold did more than just starve their fields, it also trapped them. Thick, impenetrable sea ice began to clog the ocean routes to Iceland and Europe. A frozen wall that could hold ships captive for months or even years. This isolation was catastrophic. It cut off their lifeline, the trade for essential goods like iron, timber, and new grain that they could no longer grow themselves. The vibrant society that once traded, prized walrus ivory with kings, was now a starving, freezing island, utterly alone in a world that was growing colder by the year. This theory paints a grimly logical picture of a colony, simply overwhelmed by forces far beyond its control. A testament to how fragile human civilization can be when the environment shifts. But is a changing climate enough to explain why not a single soul remained, and why they left behind no clear message of their fate? Yet the cold was only one part of the slow, crushing pressure that was suffocating their world. Their very survival was tied to a currency of the sea, a luxury trade that was about to vanish. The Greenland Vikings had built their economy on a single, precious export, walrus ivory, and the long, spiraled tusks of narwhals, which were sold in Europe as the horns of mythical unicorn. For centuries, this trade was their lifeline, allowing them to import the iron for their tools, the timber for their ships and homes, and the grain they could not reliably grow themselves. But then the market for their unique treasures simply collapsed. European fashion shifted. New trade routes opened to Africa and Asia, flooding the market with elephant ivory that was easier to obtain and often of higher quality. Suddenly, the arduous, dangerous hunt for walrus in the frozen Arctic waters was no longer worth the price it commanded. Their entire economic foundation, the reason for their existence on that harsh frontier, crumbled into dust. Imagine working for years to perfect a craft, only to have the world decide it no longer wants what you make. That is the profound isolation they faced, an economic abandonment that cut even deeper than the physical ice. They were now stranded, not just by frozen seas, but by a changing global economy that had forgotten them. Without the means to trade, they could not sustain the very society they had built. Their tools broke with no iron to mend them. Their ships rotted with no new timber to repair them. The colony was being systematically dismantled, piece by essential piece. But does this explain a complete and total disappearance? Or does it merely set the stage for something far more desperate and far more mysterious to occur? But even as the ice tightened its grip and their trade collapsed, the Greenland Norse were not alone on the island. A new people were moving in from the north, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, a culture known as the Thule. Where the Norse were farmers, tied to their land and livestock, the Thule were masters of the sea. Their entire world was one of profound adaptation. They built sleek, skin-covered kayaks and umiaks to hunt the largest whales in the ocean. They crafted sophisticated tools from bone and stone, and their warm, tailored sealskin clothing was a technological marvel compared to the Norse woolens in the deepening cold. Here were two worlds, side by side, with two entirely different definitions of survival. The Norse clung to their European identity, to their stone churches and their grazing herds. The Thule moved with the seasons and the sea ice, a way of life perfectly honed for the very world that was killing their neighbors. The archaeological record holds chilling clues that these two cultures did not always live in peace. At a Norse farmstead known as the Sandnes site, archaeologists found a single telling artifact buried near a door, a slender arrowhead made of whalebone, a material the Norse never used. It was lodged exactly where it would have struck a person standing inside. This silent weapon points to a moment of violence, a skirmish at the very threshold of a Norse home. Was this an isolated raid, or a sign of a much broader, desperate conflict for dwindling resources. The stubborn Norse, refusing to abandon their European ways, may have seen the Inuit not as potential allies, but as competitors and threats. In their pride, they might have fought the very people who held the knowledge to survive the changing land. Could a series of violent clashes have been the final blow that shattered the colony? Or did a handful of survivors, broken and starving, finally cast aside their pride and vanish into the Inuit communities, assimilating so completely that their European identity was lost forever? The evidence is as fragmented as a piece of whalebone, leaving us to wonder if the end came from a spear point, or from a slow, final surrender of a culture that could no longer sustain itself. These logical explanations of ice and economics still leave a haunting question hanging in the cold air. If the end was so slow and predictable, why does the evidence feel so incomplete? A society facing a gradual famine would have left behind mass graves, a silent testimony to their final days. Yet no such sites have been found. If conflict with the Inuit was the final blow, where are the burned fortresses, the caches of weapons, the clear layers of destruction that archaeologists so often uncover at sites of war? The evidence for violence remains tantalizingly sparse. A few arrowheads, not a battlefield. And if they were simply starving, why did they not abandon their European pride completely? They could have learned from the Inuit, adopting the seal hunts and flexible kayaks that were so perfectly suited to the new ice age. Their bones show signs of malnutrition in the final years, but not the mass starvation you would expect from a people who had given up entirely. They were clearly trying to survive, yet they failed. This is the core paradox. The conventional stories provide a backdrop, a stage setting of hardship, but they cannot fully explain the final act, the complete and utter silence. It is as if the final answer does not lie in the soil or the ice cores, but somewhere else entirely, in the realm of belief and spirit. What if their downfall was not just a physical struggle, but a spiritual one? What if they lost the favor of the land itself? Perhaps we have been asking the wrong questions all along. We have sifted through the soil for bones and the ice for climate data. But what if the truest record of their disappearance was not written in stone or ice, but in the silent language of belief? To find the lost colony of Greenland, we may need to leave the tools of the archaeologist behind and pick up the lantern of the mystic. This is the path of the esoteric, a way of seeing that looks beyond the physical world to the spiritual forces and hidden patterns that might shape human destiny. It invites us to consider a radical idea. What if the Vikings did not just starve or fight their way into oblivion? What if they encountered something on that vast, icy landscape that our modern science cannot easily quantify? A spiritual dissonance so profound it unraveled their very will to remain. This is not about dismissing the hard evidence of a changing climate, but about asking what happens to the human spirit when the world it knows is dying. Could their final chapter be one of desperate rituals, of whispered prayers to old gods and new, of a community trying to bargain with powers they could no longer understand? We are about to step across a threshold, from the solid ground of historical fact into the misty realms of the unexplained, where the land itself might hold a memory, and where a people's faith could be the final key to their vanishing. To grasp the deeper mystery of their end, we must first step into the minds of these settlers, a world far removed from our own. The Greenland Norse were not merely farmers huddled against the cold. They were the inheritors of a spiritual reality where the veil between worlds was whisper thin. Their universe was alive with intention, populated by gods of thunder and fate, but also by more immediate, local spirits known as the Landvita. These were the guardians of the land itself, the spirits of a particular rock, a stream, or a fjord. To prosper, one had to live in harmony with these beings, showing them respect through offerings and mindful action. A farmer would not build his home without considering their presence, for to offend a landvita was to invite crop failure, sickness, or a sudden, inexplicable disaster. This was not a casual superstition. It was the fundamental operating system of their world. Alongside this deep connection to the land walked figures of immense power, the Völvers. These were seeressses, women who could sit on high seats and travel in spirit to see the future, to find lost animals, or to discern the will of the gods. Their magic was real and tangible, a force that could shape the fortunes of an entire community. And then there were the runes. These were not merely an alphabet for writing messages. Each runic character was believed to hold a specific power, a hidden energy that could be unlocked for healing, for protection, or for curse. A rune carved onto a doorpost was a shield. One etched onto a weapon was a plea for victory. This was the lens through which the Greenlanders viewed their collapsing world. When the summers grew shorter and the hay would not grow, it was not just bad weather. It was a sign the landvita were angry. When the sea ice closed their harbors, it was not just a shift in climate. The gods were withholding their favor. Their reality was a constant conversation with the unseen. And as their physical world crumbled, that conversation would have become one of desperation and terror. What rituals did they perform in those final, freezing winters? What runes did they carve into the wooden beams of their homes, not as words, but as spells against the encroaching dark? Their vanishing act begins to look less like a simple failure to adapt, and more like the final, silent note in a long and frantic spiritual plea that went unanswered. Amidst the deepening cold and the silence from Europe, the Völvers would have been more crucial than ever. These seeressses held the power to look beyond the present misery, to travel in spirit and ask the most terrifying question of all: what comes next? Their rituals were profound acts of vision. A Völver would sit upon a high platform, a seat of power, often surrounded by her community. She might enter a trance through rhythmic chanting, perhaps aided by psychoactive plants, her spirit journeying beyond her physical body to converse with spirits and ancestors. In this altered state, she could discern the hidden threads of weird. This Norse concept of fate was not a simple, predetermined path. It was more like a great, woven tapestry. The past and present were fixed threads, but the future remained a loose, unwoven length of yarn, its final pattern still subject to the choices and actions of people, and the will of the gods. A Völver's gift was to see the potential patterns in that unwoven thread. So what did the Völvers of Greenland's final days see? Did their spirits travel over the frozen fjords and return with visions of endless ice, of fields that would never again grow green? Did they witness, in their mind's eye, the spectral silence of their own empty churches? A prophecy of inevitable doom, delivered from such a revered and feared figure, could have fundamentally broken the colony's spirit. It would have transformed their struggle from a physical challenge to overcome into a spiritual sentence already passed. Why fight to survive a winter if the oracle has declared that 10 winters hence, no one will remain? This could explain the eerie lack of mass graves or evidence of a final, desperate stand. It might not be that they gave up, but that they accepted their fate. Their disappearance begins to look less like a chaotic collapse, and more like a solemn, collective acquiescence to a destiny they believed was inescapable. But what if the prophecy was not one of doom, but of direction? Perhaps the vision was not an end, but a path. A Völver might have seen a land across the sea, a new beginning to the west where the threads of their weird could be woven anew. In this light, the abandonment of Greenland becomes something else entirely, a spiritually directed exodus. They did not simply flee into the wilderness to die. They gathered their belongings, boarded their ships with a solemn purpose, and sailed west toward a promised land seen only in a seer's trance, following a celestial map drawn by prophecy. This would mean the lost colony is not a grave marker, but a stepping stone. They vanished because they were aiming for a future that, for reasons we may never know, they ultimately failed to reach. Their fate was sealed not by ice, but by a vision that either consumed them with despair or guided them toward a horizon from which they never returned. The silence of the Greenland colony is so profound that we strain to hear even the echoes of their final prayers. But if we listen with more than our ears, we might sense the whispers they left behind, not in words, but in power carved into wood and stone. We must consider the runes. In their final days, as the wind howled with a new, deeper cold, the logical response would have been a spiritual one. A farmer watching his livestock grow thin would not have simply waited. He might have taken his knife to the doorframe of his longhouse, carefully carving the rune alges, a shape like a person with arms upraised, a desperate plea for divine protection over his home and family. Another, facing a dwindling food store, might have etched the rune Jura, the symbol for the harvest and the turning of the year, a magical attempt to force the cycle of growth back into a world that was freezing solid. These were not mere letters. Each rune was a conduit, a focused intention meant to channel unseen forces. They believed that by shaping the symbol, they could manifest its essence into reality. The act of carving was itself a ritual, a concentrated effort to bend a hostile world back toward balance. Yet, as the ice continued its advance, these silent, invisible pleas would have seemed to fall on deaf ears. The magic was failing. We can almost feel the rising desperation in each new carving, the shift from hopeful petition to frantic demand. What began as a prayer for protection might have evolved into a curse against the cold itself, or a rune of binding meant to trap the last vestiges of warmth in the soil. The land itself could hold this spiritual residue, an imprint of collective fear and fervent hope that, while invisible to our tools, might still linger in the quiet of those abandoned fjords. This theory offers a heartbreaking possibility. The colonists did not just run out of food, they ran out of hope because their magic, the very framework through which they understood and influenced their world, had proven powerless. Their vanishing becomes a different kind of tragedy. It was not just a physical evacuation, but a spiritual surrender, the moment they realized their runes could no longer save them, and that the gods had truly turned away. Their desperate rune carvings were a conversation with the unseen. But what if the land itself had stopped listening? The Norse did not see Greenland as an empty territory to be conquered, but as a living entity with its own guardians, the Landvitir. These spirits were the soul of the place, inhabiting a distinctive rock formation, a hidden spring, or a quiet, sheltered valley. Prosperity was a gift from them, given in exchange for respect and harmony. The colonists' initial success suggests they once had this balance, but as their situation grew dire, that sacred contract may have shattered. To survive, they would have pushed their farms to the absolute limit, cutting down the last stands of precious willow and birch for fuel and building materials. They would have overhunted the caribou and seal populations, taking more than the land could sustainably give. Every act of desperation, though born of need, could have been seen as a profound insult by the spirits who called that land home. Imagine a farmer, his family starving, clearing a new field in a grove that had been untouched for centuries. To him it was survival, to the Landvitir it was a violation of a sacred space, a trespass that demanded a response. The very foundation of their society might have been the original offense. They were farmers trying to impose a European agricultural template onto a landscape that was fundamentally wild and maritime. They carved out pastures for their grazing animals, disrupting the native flora and fauna. They built their stone churches, structures that declared dominion over a land that operated on a different, more ancient set of rules. This was not just a cultural clash with the Inuit. It was a spiritual clash with the land itself. The Landvitir of Greenland were not the spirits of tamed fields and docile livestock. They were the spirits of the ice floe, the whale and the stark, treeless mountain. By refusing to fully adapt to the land's true nature, by stubbornly clinging to a lifestyle that was increasingly unsustainable, the Norse may have been sending a continuous message of disrespect. The Landvitir's blessing would have been their protection, a subtle force that ensured a successful hunt, a mild winter, or a calm sea. When that blessing was withdrawn, the land would have turned actively hostile. The cold would have felt sharper, the storms more sudden, the game more elusive. This is not a meteorological event, but a spiritual one. Their world was not just growing colder, it was growing hollow, its protective spirit gone. What remained was a shell, a beautiful but merciless landscape that no longer wished to support them. Their final departure then becomes more than an evacuation, it is a banishment. They did not just leave a place that could no longer sustain their bodies. They fled a land that had rejected their very presence. This deepening spiritual crisis would have torn at the very fabric of their community. For centuries, the Greenland Norse had walked a delicate line between two worlds. Officially, they were Christian, answerable to a bishop in Norway, and proud of their stone churches. But beneath that surface, the old ways never truly died. The Völvas and their rune magic persisted, a deep underground stream of pagan belief flowing right alongside the new religion. In the colony's prosperous years, this duality might have been manageable, a quiet compromise. But as starvation and isolation set in, that fragile truce would have shattered. Imagine a community meeting in a freezing longhouse. The Christian authorities, perhaps the local priest or a powerful landowner, would have urged prayer and penance. They would have interpreted the endless winter as a test from their God, a divine punishment for their sins that required unwavering faith and adherence to church doctrine. To them, the solution was to cling more tightly to their European identity, to wait for a ship from the bishop, to trust in a salvation that never came. Across from them, the voices of the old beliefs would have spoken a very different truth. The pagan elders and the remaining Völvas would have seen the failing crops and the thinning herds not as a test from a distant god, but as a clear sign of anger from the local Landvitir. Their solution would not have been prayer, but action. They might have argued for a revival of the old rituals, for offerings to the spirits of the fjord and the ice. They may have even advocated for the most radical action of all, to learn from the Inuit, to set aside their plows and their woolens, and embrace the ways of the sea and the hunt. This was not a simple theological debate. It was a battle for the colony's soul and its survival. One side saw adaptation as a betrayal of their faith and their king. The other saw stubbornness as a death sentence. A community paralyzed by such a fundamental schism cannot act decisively. While its leaders argued over the correct way to pray, the last of the stored food would have dwindled. While they debated the nature of God's will, the sea ice would have sealed them in for another year. This internal conflict could have been as deadly as any external threat. It would have broken the trust and shared purpose necessary for a community to endure a crisis. Families may have split along these spiritual lines, some holding fast to the church, others secretly consulting a Völva in the dead of night. This spiritual civil war, fought in whispers and fearful glances, could have drained their last reserves of hope. The colony did not just face ice and hunger, it faced an impossible choice between two visions of salvation. And in their inability to choose one path wholeheartedly, they may have chosen neither. Their silence is the echo of that final, unresolvable argument. Perhaps the most haunting question is not why they left, but where they intended to go. If their world was spiritually hollow, if their runes had failed and their gods were silent, then the only logical step was a pilgrimage, a deliberate exodus to a land they believed was promised. This was not a panicked flight from starvation, but a solemn, organized withdrawal guided by vision. The final Norse ships did not simply drift away from the Greenland fjords to be swallowed by the sea. They sailed with purpose. Their holds would have carried not just the last of their food and tools, but their most sacred possessions, the church bells, the communion vessels, the rune staves of the Völvers. This was the relocation of an entire culture's soul. What omens guided their course? A Völver's trance vision of a western shore with green forests and gentle climates, a land free of the grinding ice. A series of prophetic dreams shared among the community's leaders, all pointing in the same direction. Or perhaps a collective spiritual calling, a unified certainty that their weird, their fate, could only be rewoven on a new loom, far from a land that had cast them out. They were not refugees, they were seekers. Their journey would have been one of profound secrecy. To a people who felt abandoned by both their European kin and their God, the outside world held no trust. Why would they leave a record for a bishop who never came, or a king who had forgotten them? Their departure was a final act of spiritual independence, a severing of ties so complete that it was meant to erase them from the memory of the old world. This theory transforms their vanishing from a tragedy into an epic. It suggests they did not die out in Greenland, but that they successfully sailed into the mists of the North American coastline, perhaps merging with indigenous populations further south. Their distinct identity slowly dissolving over generations until only whispers remain. Their legacy would not be ruins, but a ghostly influence, a strand of European spirituality woven so subtly into the tapestry of the New World that we have never been able to pull the thread. The lost colony is lost because it wanted to be. It achieved the ultimate silence, not through death, but through a successful and secret rebirth. The idea of a secret exodus leads us directly to a place they already knew, a land they called Vinland. Generations before the Greenland colony failed, their own explorers had ventured to the coast of North America, establishing a fleeting settlement at a place we now call Elance Orks Meadows. They knew this western shore existed, a land of towering forests and wild grapes, a world away from their own treeless, freezing fjords. It is not just plausible, but deeply logical, that their final, desperate hope was to return there. This would not have been a voyage of discovery, but a targeted migration, a flight toward a remembered refuge. They would have packed their remaining ships with everything sacred and essential, turning their backs on a Greenland that had become a spiritual tomb, and sailing with a grim determination toward a new beginning. The journey itself would have been an epic trial, a test of their remaining strength and their faith in the Völver's visions. But if even a handful of ships made it, the story of the Greenland Vikings does not end in silence. It simply moves to a new stage, one far more difficult for history to trace. They would have arrived on the vast North American coastline not as conquerors, but as supplicants, a ragged band of survivors utterly dependent on the goodwill of the people already living there. This is where history dissolves into whispers, and where we must listen to the stories told by the land itself. Among some Native American tribes, particularly those in the northeastern woodlands, there exist ancient oral histories that speak of a mysterious people. These stories, sometimes grouped under the term Hopewell myth, describe encounters with light-skinned strangers who arrived from the direction of the sunrise, from the sea. These strangers were said to possess unusual technologies or knowledge, and for a time they lived alongside the indigenous people, sometimes in peace, sometimes in conflict, before eventually being absorbed or vanishing back into the landscape. Could these faint, enduring echoes be the final chapter of the Greenland colony? Imagine a small group of Norse, their European clothing in tatters, their numbers dwindling from disease and hardship, being taken in by a local tribe. They would have brought with them fragments of their culture, perhaps the skill of iron working, or a unique style of weaving, or even just the striking physical features that set them apart. Over a few generations, their distinct identity would have melted away, their language forgotten, their stories blending with those of their hosts, until the only thing that remained was a legend, a tale of strange visitors from across the water. This merging would have been a quiet, organic process, leaving no ruins, no forts, and no written records for archaeologists to find. Their legacy would be genetic, a subtle strand of European DNA found in some pre-Columbian indigenous remains, and it would be mythological, a story told around fires for centuries. The lost colony of Greenland, then, may not have vanished at all. They may have simply come home, finding their final rest not in the cold ground of a failed settlement, but in the living memory and bloodlines of a new world. That lonely stone tower standing in a Newport park is a riddle written in mortar and stone. While history books often credit a colonial governor with its construction in the 1600s, its very design whispers of a much older and stranger origin. The architecture is the key to its mystery. This is not a typical English mill from the colonial era. Its construction is circular, with 8 sturdy pillars supporting a vaulted ceiling, a design that echoes the round churches built across Scandinavia during the Viking Age, structures meant for worship and community gathering. Why would early American colonists, building in a familiar Gothic style for every other structure, suddenly erect this ancient alien form? It stands as an architectural ghost, a structure out of time and place. Could this be the solitary, crumbling signature of the lost Greenlanders, the last building they ever raised? Imagine a battered Norse Nar, carrying the final survivors of the eastern settlement, limping into the sheltered waters of Narragansett Bay. They are weary, their numbers thin, but they are still a people who define themselves by their faith and their community. Their first act in this new world is not to build a fort, but to build a church, a familiar round tower where they can sing hymns and seek the blessing of their God in a land they hope will be more forgiving than the one they left. They construct it not as a permanent home, but as a beacon, a declaration that their culture has taken root once more. But the new beginning they prayed for never comes. Perhaps sickness or conflict with the native peoples who had lived there for millennia, or simply the accumulated exhaustion of their long exodus finally overwhelms them. The community dwindles and vanishes, leaving only their silent stone tower to be found centuries later by English colonists, who would puzzle over its purpose and ultimately claim it as their own. The Newport Tower is a haunting possibility. It represents not a grave, but a last desperate prayer made solid, a monument to a dream of a future that flickered for a moment in the New England woods before being extinguished forever. Far to the west of that lonely Newport Tower, another stone speaks from the soil with a voice that is both compelling and fiercely contested. In the late 1800s, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman was clearing trees on his land in Kensington, Minnesota, when his plow struck a large, flat stone tangled in the roots of a poplar tree. Carved into its face was a message in runes, a text that would ignite one of the most heated debates in American history. The inscription told a harrowing tale, dated to the year 1362, of a journey of exploration from Vinland. It spoke of 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on a voyage that ended in bloodshed, leaving 10 men dead and red with blood. The message concludes with a plea, a cry to the Virgin Mary to save them from evil. If genuine, this stone would rewrite history, placing Norse explorers deep in the heart of North America, over 130 years before Columbus. Mainstream scholarship has largely dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, pointing to anachronistic language and the convenient nature of its discovery. But what if we look past the debate over its authenticity and ask a different, more esoteric question? What if, whether carved in the 14th century or the 19th, this stone functions as something more than a historical record? What if it is a genuine artifact of human desperation, a runic spell of protection cast into the earth? The inscription is not a dry logbook entry. It is a narrative of terror and a direct appeal to a higher power. The plea to the Virgin Mary is not just a religious footnote. It is the emotional core of the message. In the Norse tradition, runes were not mere letters, they were vessels of power. A skilled rune carver could weave intention into the stone, turning a message into a talisman. Imagine this group, whether medieval explorers or a different lost band, surrounded by a hostile, unknown land. They are wounded, grieving, and fearing their own imminent death. Their leader, or perhaps their own Völva, takes up a chisel. This is not an act of record-keeping for future historians. It is an act of last resort. Each rune is struck with a specific purpose, to create a shield of spiritual energy around the remaining men. The stone itself becomes an anchor, a fixed point of power planted in the soil to ward off the evil that stalks them. The date, the names, the grisly account of death, these are not just facts. In a magical context, naming a thing gives you power over it. By explicitly naming their tragedy, they may have been attempting to bind it, to contain the malevolent force that had caused it. The stone is a boundary marker, both physical and spiritual, declaring beyond this point, you shall not pass. This perspective transforms the Kensington runestone from a potential fraud into a profound human artifact. Its true message is not about who reached America first, but about the universal human response to existential terror. It is a fossilized moment of prayer, a scream for salvation carved in stone. Echoing the same desperate pleas we can imagine the last Greenlanders uttering as their own world froze around them. Could this stone be the final fragmented record of a splinter group from the lost Greenland colony? A band that refused to surrender to the ice and instead sailed west into legend, only to meet a different, more violent end. Or is it, on another level of reality, a genuine magical working whose power lies not in its historical truth, but in the raw, undeniable truth of the fear that created it? There is a version of their story that reaches beyond archaeology and into the realm of sacred myth. The silence of Greenland echoes the most famous silence of all, the one that fell over the court of King Arthur after the quest for the Holy Grail was done. In the Arthurian legends, the Grail is not merely a physical cup. It is the ultimate symbol of divine grace, a spiritual secret so potent it can only be held in a land that is itself pure and holy. The Grail Castle is often described as a hidden, protected place, a sanctuary for the sacred that vanishes from the sight of the unworthy. Now consider Greenland not as a failed colony, but as a fallen Avalon. The very name Erik the Red chose, Greenland, paints the picture of a lush, almost paradisiacal land, a green island in the Northern Sea. For centuries, it was exactly that for the Norse, a sanctuary where their society and their faith flourished against all odds. It was their Avalon, a remote and hallowed ground. But what if this sanctuary was not just a home for people, but a hiding place for something far more precious? Some esoteric traditions whisper that when the Grail vanished from Arthurian Britain, its guardians took it to the farthest edge of the known world, to a green land at the top of the map. A place so remote it would be safe from the corruption and warfare of Europe. The Greenland colony, in this light, was not a random settlement. It was a sacred charge, a monastic order of sorts, tasked with protecting the world's greatest spiritual secret as the Dark Ages closed in around them. Their gradual isolation was not an accident. It was part of the design. The encroaching ice that sealed them off from the world was not a curse, but a shield, a divine quarantine to protect the relic from a humanity that was no longer ready for its power. Their disappearance, then, is not a tragedy of starvation, but the final successful act of their guardianship. As the world grew colder and the ice advanced, the land itself was transforming from a green Avalon into a frozen, impenetrable fortress. The protectors of the Grail had a choice: to stay and be discovered by a changing world, or to take their charge and vanish completely, fulfilling their oath by erasing themselves from history. They did not die out. They accomplished their mission. They withdrew so completely into the mists of legend that the land they left behind was no longer a green promise, but a white wasteland, a perfect camouflage for a secret that was never meant to be found. The lost colony is lost because it succeeded in its ultimate purpose: to hide the light so well that the world forgot it was ever there. This entire saga of rise and fall mirrors an ancient spiritual science, the alchemical quest for the philosopher's stone. We can view the Greenland colony itself as a grand, centuries-long alchemical experiment, a great work conducted not in a laboratory, but on the vast, unforgiving stage of the Arctic. The settlers, their animals, and their dreams were the prime matter, the raw, unrefined substance placed into the alchemist's flask. For generations, the experiment seemed to prosper. They built their churches and farms, a society crystallizing from the chaos of a new land. This was the initial stage of cleansing and preparation, where the base materials were gathered with hope and ambition. But then the process entered its most difficult and necessary phase, the nigredo. In alchemy, the nigredo is the blackening, a period of putrefaction and despair where the original matter breaks down into a uniform, dark mass. It is a time of death and dissolution that is essential for any true transformation to begin. The Greenland colony entered its long nigredo as the ice advanced. The failure of their trade, the starvation in their fields, the conflict at their doors, and the spiritual schism in their hearts, this was all part of the blackening. The vibrant community decayed into a state of uniform suffering and hopelessness, a dark night of the soul for an entire civilization. The alchemist understands that this stage, while terrifying, is not the end. It is the crucial test. Within that blackness, if the process is successful, a new essence begins to separate and rise, leading to the albedo, the whitening, and finally the rubedo, the reddening, which heralds the creation of the gold and the completion of the great work. But for the Greenlanders, the rubedo never came. The final, brilliant transformation, the creation of a new, spiritually resilient society adapted to its world, was the goal they failed to produce. They could not transmute the lead of their hardship into a sustainable golden age. Their experiment ended not in transcendence, but in dissolution. The flask did not contain a gleaming stone, only a silent, empty residue. The colony did not achieve a higher state of being. It simply ceased to be, its matter returning to the elements from which it came. This perspective offers a profound and melancholy truth. Their story is not one of random disaster, but of a spiritual process left incomplete. They endured the necessary death of the nigredo, but they could not find the secret that would allow them to be reborn. What final ingredient was missing from their crucible? Was it the humility to fully merge with the new land, or a collective faith strong enough to catalyze their own redemption? Their silence is the sound of an alchemist's fire being extinguished, leaving only cold ash and an unanswered question hanging in the air. The silent fjords of Greenland held more than just the whispers of the past. They were a stage for a cosmic drama written in the stars. The Norse were not merely farmers waiting for rescue. They were keen astronomers, their lives and fates intimately tied to the movements of the heavens. To understand their final, desperate act, we must look up and reconstruct the celestial landscape of their final century. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time of profound astrological turmoil, a period that would have screamed warnings to any who knew how to read the sky. In 1345, a spectacular conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars blazed in the constellation of Aquarius. For a culture that saw these planets as embodiments of fate, restriction, and conflict, this triple meeting would have been interpreted as a cataclysmic omen, a direct celestial verdict of hardship, cold, and inevitable endings. This was not a subtle sign. It was a blazing declaration from the gods that the world was shifting against them. Then, just a few decades later, Halley's comet scarred the sky in 1306. We know from European chronicles that this apparition was seen as a portent of plague and disaster. For the isolated Greenlanders, already feeling the icy grip of the Little Ice Age, the sudden appearance of this wandering star, this spectral traveler with its fiery tail, would have confirmed their deepest fears. The heavens themselves were unraveling. An eclipse, blotting out the sun or the moon, would have been the ultimate confirmation. The loss of light, even for a few minutes, symbolized the extinguishing of divine favor, a literal darkening of their world that mirrored the spiritual darkness closing in around them. These were not random astronomical events. They were a sequence of celestial sentences being passed. A Völva interpreting these signs would have had no other conclusion to draw. The runes had failed, the Landvitir were angry, and now the very planets were aligning to pronounce their doom. This accumulation of heavenly evidence could have been the final, undeniable catalyst. It was no longer just about starving or freezing. It was about disobeying a direct command written in the sky. The decision to leave was not an act of surrender, but an act of obedience to a higher cosmic law. They gathered their ships not in panic, but in solemn ritual, following a celestial map that pointed away from a cursed land and toward a destiny they believed the stars had ordained. The sea holds memories deeper than any written chronicle. Across the scattered islands of the North Atlantic, from Iceland to the remote coasts of Greenland, old sailors' tales speak of a haunting sight in the mist, the Silent Fleet. These are not mere ghost stories. They are detailed accounts of weathered longships with faded, striped sails, gliding soundlessly through the fog banks, their decks empty of crew. The descriptions are always the same. The vessels are intact, even beautiful, but they are utterly devoid of life, moving with a purpose no living hand guides. For centuries, these sightings were dismissed as superstition, the fanciful fears of men alone on a vast ocean. But what if they are something else entirely? What if these spectral ships are a folk memory, a psychic echo of the Greenland colony's final, desperate voyage? An entire population did not simply dissolve into the soil. They would have taken to their ships. The last image of the Norse in Greenland, burned into the collective unconscious of the region, would have been that of a fleet setting out to sea, never to be seen again. Is it any wonder that the image of the ghost ship, the vessel that sails on without its people, became the region's most enduring phantom? On the other side of this historical divide, the ancestral Inuit have their own stories, whispers passed from elder to child for generations. They do not speak of ghost ships, but of the vanishing. Their oral traditions tell of the Kalanot, the pale strangers who lived in the stone houses by the fjords. The stories describe them as a stubborn people, tied to their strange animals and their ways that seem to fight the land itself. And then the stories say they were gone. Some tales suggest they simply walked inland, into the heart of the great ice cap, searching for something they never found. Others speak of a gradual fading, their numbers dwindling until one day there was only silence. These are not detailed historical records, but they are something perhaps more profound, a mythological fingerprint of a real, witnessed tragedy. The Inuits saw the beginning and the end of the Norse experiment in Greenland. Their folklore preserves the core truth of the event: a people who arrived, struggled against the grain of the land, and ultimately disappeared. The specific details were lost to time, but the essential shape of the catastrophe was etched into their cultural memory. This is how history endures when parchment fails. It transforms into legend, its truth carried not in dates and names, but in the archetypal power of the story itself. When we place these two sets of folklore side by side, the Nordic ghost ships and the Inuit tales of the walkers into the ice, a startlingly complete picture begins to emerge. It is a picture of a schism, a final, fatal split in the colony's last days. One faction, perhaps those who still believed in the old seafaring ways and the Völva's vision of a western land, would have taken to their ships. They bet their entire future on one last voyage, a gamble that ended with their vessels becoming the phantom fleet of legend, forever sailing the border between our world and the next. The other faction, those who had lost all faith in the sea, or who were too weak to make the journey, might have made a different, even more desperate choice. Turning their backs on the water, they could have looked toward the immense, white expanse of the ice cap. In a final, ritualistic act of despair or seeking, they may have walked into that void, believing they would find a new Greenland, a hidden valley beyond the ice, or perhaps simply seeking a clean, silent end. The ghost ships and the walkers into the ice are not conflicting stories. They are two halves of the same terrible whole. They represent the two possible exits from a collapsing world, by sea and by land, both paths leading into the realm of myth. The collective unconscious of the North Atlantic did not forget the lost colony. It simply told the story in the only language that could contain such a profound mystery, the language of folklore and phantom. The ghost ships and the silent walkers are not just echoes from a distant past. They are a mirror reflecting a crisis we face today. The story of Greenland's collapse is more than a historical mystery. It is a spiritual parable for our own age. We are living through our own version of the Little Ice Age, a global climatic shift driven not by natural cycles, but by our own hands. The signs are everywhere in the raging wildfires, the vanishing glaciers, and the rising, acidifying seas. Science gives us the data, the graphs, and the models. But like the Norse reading the runes, we are being given a message that transcends mere numbers. The land is speaking, and it is angry. The Vikings failed to listen to their world. They saw the shorter summers and the advancing ice as a practical hardship, a logistical problem to be endured. They did not understand it as a spiritual feedback loop, a direct consequence of living out of balance with the forces that sustain them. They tried to solve a spiritual crisis with physical tools alone, carving runes for protection, while their way of life continued to violate the very land they relied upon. We are now doing the same. We search for technological fixes, for greener energy and carbon capture, and these are vital efforts. But if we ignore the deeper, esoteric warning, we are merely carving new runes on a dying world. The underlying issue is a profound disconnect, a belief that we are separate from nature, that we can dominate and control it without consequence. The landvita of our modern world are the complex, interconnected ecosystems, the delicate balance of the atmosphere, the living intelligence of the ocean. For centuries, our industrial society has treated these forces as resources to be exploited, spirits to be offended without a second thought. We clear-cut the ancient forests, the lungs of our planet. We pollute the rivers and oceans, the lifeblood of the earth. We extract and burn the fossilized remains of a primordial world, unleashing a fever upon the land. Each of these acts is a spiritual trespass, a violation of a sacred contract with the living world. The result is not just a change in the weather, it is a withdrawal of the land's blessing. The stability that allowed our civilization to flourish is being revoked. The Greenland colony's fate teaches us that when the spiritual foundation of your existence crumbles, no amount of technical ingenuity can save you. Your world becomes hollow, a beautiful but hostile shell that no longer supports your presence. Their silent farms are a preview of our own potential future, a world where the systems that sustain us have been pushed past their breaking point. So what is the esoteric solution? It is the same one the Norse could not fully embrace, a fundamental shift in consciousness. It is to move from seeing the earth as a commodity to be used, to understanding it as a living being to be respected. It is to listen, not just with satellites and sensors, but with our intuition and our reverence. It means recognizing that every action we take, from the food we eat to the energy we consume, is part of a continuous conversation with the unseen forces of the world. The Lost Colony's final lesson is not one of despair, but of urgent spiritual imperative. Their story is a flare sent across the centuries, a warning that our survival depends not just on our science, but on our ability to restore a sacred relationship with the world we call home. So we return at last to the silent stones and the sunken hearths, but our eyes are now open to a different truth. The archaeological sites scattered across Greenland's fjords are not just crime scenes waiting for a logical explanation. They are the physical anchors of a profound spiritual rupture. Look at the skeletal remains unearthed from the churchyards. Scientific analysis confirms they suffered from chronic malnutrition in the final decades, their bones showing the subtle scars of prolonged hunger. The conventional view sees this as proof of a simple cause of death, starvation from a failing environment. But what if these bones tell a more complex story? Malnutrition is not just a lack of food. It is the final physical symptom of a system that has broken down on every level. These were not people who suddenly found themselves without resources. They were people who, for generations, had been living a way of life that was spiritually out of sync with the land itself. Their hunger was the land's final, blunt refusal to support a culture that no longer honored its essential nature. The empty farms, with tools left behind as if for a day's work, take on a new meaning. This was not a panicked evacuation. It feels more like a ritual leaving, a deliberate setting down of a life that had lost its sacred connection. Imagine a farmer, his family thin with hunger, standing in his doorway one last time. He does not take his favorite tool, not out of haste, but because the object itself has become a symbol of a broken covenant. It belongs to the old life, the one that failed. To take it would be to carry the curse with them. The very silence of these sites, the lack of mass graves or evidence of a frantic last stand, is the loudest evidence of all. A community that dies fighting for its physical survival leaves a chaotic, violent signature in the soil. But a community that has accepted a spiritual death, that has seen its magic fail and its gods fall silent, simply stops. It makes one last, quiet choice to walk away from the stage of a play that has reached its final act. The archaeology does not contradict the esoteric view. It gives it a physical form. The bones and the abandoned homes are the earthly residue of a catastrophe that began not in the fields or the fjords, but in the human soul. Perhaps the ultimate truth of Greenland's silence is that no single story can hold it. The climate turned against them, their economy evaporated, and conflict likely stalked their final days. These are the solid, logical pillars of the tragedy, the undeniable pressures that crushed their society. Yet these facts alone feel like an empty house whose furniture has been catalogued, but whose soul remains unexplained. They tell us how the body died, but not why the spirit left so completely. This is where the esoteric dimension weaves the final, essential thread into the tapestry. It provides the missing why, the human spiritual catalyst, that transformed a slow decline into a total and mysterious vanishing. The real failure was not merely of crops or trade, but of adaptation on a soul-deep level. They could not rewrite the story of who they were. A farmer from Norway could learn to build a different style of house in Greenland. But could he truly learn to see the world through the eyes of an Inuit hunter? To feel the spirit of the seal as a brother rather than a resource? Their entire cosmology, a blend of stubborn Christianity and underground pagan magic, was built for a different world. When that world changed, their spiritual tools became obsolete. The runes carved for protection did not halt the ice. The prayers to a European god did not bring a trading ship. And the angry Landvitir demanded a reverence their culture was unwilling to give. This was a catastrophic breakdown in the sacred covenant between a people and their world. The land withdrew its consent to be inhabited in their way. The silence they left behind is not the silence of a place where everyone died, but of a place where a way of life was spiritually revoked. The empty farms are not just abandoned properties. They are the physical evidence of a broken relationship. The Norse did not just run out of food, they ran out of meaning. Their world ceased to make sense, and so they walked away from its hollow shell, following either a desperate prophecy over the Western Sea or a final, quiet path into the white heart of the ice, seeking a reconciliation with the land that they could no longer find in life. Their silence across the centuries is not an empty void, but a resonant echo of our own deepest anxieties. We have journeyed together from the solid ground of climate data and economic history into the misty realms of spiritual crisis and prophetic visions. And in doing so, we have not simply solved a mystery. We have discovered why it refuses to be solved. The Lost Colony of Greenland endures in our imagination because it holds up a dark and eternal mirror. In their story, we see reflected our own collective fears of environmental collapse, of being cut off and forgotten by the world, of our own cherished ways of life becoming suddenly obsolete. It is a timeless parable about the delicate, and often fatal, balance between physical survival and the spirit that gives that survival meaning. They teach us that a people can endure almost any hardship, but they cannot endure a world that has lost its soul. Their empty homes are a question mark carved into the landscape of history, asking us what we are willing to change when our own world begins to shift. What do you think truly happened in those final, frozen days? Did they sail west into a promised land, or walk silently into the heart of the ice? Share your most mystical theories in the comments below, and join us as we continue to explore the hidden histories that shape our world.